If you're a resident of Turin, then you surely have heard about Danilo's house, a house among the most terrifying and haunted in the city. But if you're not from Turin, then you must know about it, because bad luck might lead you there, and then you won't be spending happy nights. The story begins with Mark, a nurse. After graduating, Mark decided that he wouldn't work in a hospital, but would instead work in patient care. This meant that a patient could call him for personal assistance at home. This was a reason for Mark to earn more money. Mark continued working until one day he received a call from a strange number. Mark answered to find himself speaking with someone whose voice sounded suspicious, with a strange tone that made Mark feel uneasy. The person was speaking, and it was clear that he was scared or anxious about something. Mark replied, "Hello, this is Mark. How can I assist you?" The person replied saying, "My name is Michael. I need a medical service from you." Mark welcomed him and asked what he needed. Michael said, "I need you to be at home with my father. He is elderly and can't move much, so I need you to be there and take care of him medically because he is ill." Mark welcomed the job and asked Michael to send the address via message. Moments later, the address arrived in a message to Mark on WhatsApp. Michael informed Mark that he was traveling and that Mark had to be there early because his father's health condition didn't allow him to be alone. Mark reassured him, saying, "Don't worry, I will be there within hours." After Mark confirmed the address and found it wasn't too far, about 3 hours away, he started to prepare his bag, because in cases like this, he would usually stay for more than a day. When Mark left his house, he took a taxi and headed to the address. Mark and the taxi driver moved until they reached a place that was completely deserted, with no houses or people. They drove a bit further until the house appeared in front of them, completely isolated. The taxi stopped in front of the house, and Mark got out to stand in front of the iron gate of the house. Then he took out his phone to call Michael, but strangely, the number was out of service. He tried calling again, but as usual, it was out of service. Mark stood in front of the house, which was very large, but its exterior suggested it was deserted, meaning no one lived there. Mark moved closer to the gate, and suddenly he saw someone moving inside the garden of the house. It was clear from his appearance that he was the house's guard. As soon as he reached Mark, he asked if he was the nurse. Mark learned from the guard that Michael had called and told him that he would arrive in a few hours. The guard thanked Mark for coming on time, introduced himself as Tiago, the guard responsible for protecting the villa. Mark enters the house with Tiago, and Tiago begins to speak to him, showing him around the house while describing the villa as very quiet. It consists of 2 floors. The first floor is designated for hosting guests and contains a small lounge, the kitchen, and a bathroom. The second floor contains the bedrooms and the living room. The only ones in the villa are Michael's elderly father, Danilo, who can't move at all, and Mark is supposed to take care of him for a while. After a tour of the house, Tiago shows Mark the room where he will sleep. It's a simple room with a medium-sized bed, a wardrobe, and a private bathroom. They both leave Mark's room to go to Danilo's room, whom Mark will be taking care of. As they enter, they find him sleeping on the bed. Tiago speaks to him, introducing Mark, who will be responsible for his care. Danilo welcomes Mark and begins to talk to him, saying that the place is comfortable. After their conversation ends, Mark and Tiago leave the room, and then Tiago tells Mark that he can go in and rest for a bit. If Danilo needs anything, he will ring the bell. Mark enters his room after Tiago informs him that he will be leaving to go home. After Tiago leaves the house, Mark empties his bag into the wardrobe and then sits on the bed, feeling anxious and scared. He tries to convince himself that it's just because the place is new and somewhat deserted, but eventually Mark decides to continue until the job is done. Suddenly, his train of thought is interrupted by his phone ringing, and it's his fiancée, Eileen. Mark tells her about his job and the strange house that's making him feel anxious and scared. Suddenly, Mark hears the bell ring, indicating that Danilo needs something from him. He tells Eileen that he has to hang up now because of work and that he'll get back to her on WhatsApp. After ending the call, Mark goes to Danilo's room. Danilo was lying on the bed as before. Mark starts talking to him while getting him his medication. After finishing his request, Danilo asks Mark to turn off the TV so he can sleep. Mark finishes with Danilo and returns to his room to call Eileen to continue their conversation. Because his voice was pleasant, he began to sing until suddenly Mark hears a very loud scream, a sound as if someone screaming was dying, and what's stranger is that it sounded very close to Mark. Hearing the scream, the phone falls from his hand, and he starts looking around the room, but there's no one else there. Mark gets up from the bed, and the first thing he thinks of is Danilo. Despite the difficulty in believing that the sound could have come from Danilo, given its strength and Danilo's frailty, he decides to check on him. As soon as he opens the door, he finds Danilo lying on the bed, as calm and steady as ever. Mark approaches Danilo and notices that Danilo is breathing regularly and everything seems normal. Mark tries to wake him and tells him about the sound he heard. Mark enters the house with Tiago. Tiago starts talking to him, showing him around the house and describing the villa as very quiet. Mark leaves Danilo's room, wondering about the source of the sound and whether he really heard it or if it was all just illusions caused by his fear. He remembers he was talking to Eileen, so he quickly goes back to check the call recording. However, to his surprise, the sound of the scream was not clear, and Eileen hadn't even noticed it. Mark tries to convince himself that the sound came from the phone, but he is sure it was very clear. Standing confused and scared, unsure of how to act, Mark decides to go down to the ground floor of the house, guessing that Tiago might have returned or there might be a burglar in the house. He searches the entire house, entering every room, but they were all empty. There was nothing and no sign of anyone. He stops at the exit door, thinking that maybe someone in the street is in trouble and calling for help. But as soon as Mark stands there, he steps back 2 paces out of fear and shock. Suddenly, he hears a voice calling for Danilo, with knocks on the door. Mark is very scared and approaches a small glass window in the door to see who is outside. Suddenly, he sees in front of him a very tall, dark-skinned man with a thick and massive mustache. Mark is very afraid of him. Mark responds with a voice full of fear and alarm, asking who he is. The man replies in a thick and very strong voice that he is Stefan, the personal guard of the house. Mark doesn't believe him and tells him that the guard here is named Tiago, whom he has seen. The man continues as if he doesn't hear Mark and tells him he knows he is Mark, the nurse responsible for Danilo, and understands he might be scared of him because he doesn't know him. He advises Mark to pay attention and not be afraid of any sound he hears, and to act as if he didn't hear anything until the night passes, and specifically told him not to go to Danilo, no matter how much he calls for him. Mark is puzzled and tells him that he is here to assist Danilo, not to play around. Stefan responds to Mark with an angry tone, saying that he will hurt himself by doing so, and advises him to run away if he can. Mark ignores him and re-enters the house. Suddenly, he feels pain in his throat. He goes to look in the mirror and sees a large blood stain, as if someone had stabbed him. Suddenly, Mark hears a noise from the house, as if someone is moving behind him. He looks behind him in the house but finds nothing. He looks again in the direction of Stefan, but doesn't find him. He has completely disappeared without a trace. Mark re-enters the house again and closes the door. As soon as he turns around, he sees Stefan standing in front of him, screaming for him to run. As soon as those words were spoken, the lights in the house went out. But after a few moments, they came back on, and the house was completely empty. Mark began to have difficulty breathing, a sensation that always accompanied him whenever he was stressed or scared, and his ability to move was diminished. He decided that he must leave the house. But as soon as he thought of leaving, he heard a loud noise, like something had fallen on the floor upstairs. Mark decided to ignore everything that was happening and resolved to leave the place as soon as it was daylight, considering that he had a professional duty to the patient. Mark decided to go upstairs to Danilo, feeling that it could very likely be him who had fallen. Entering the room, however, he found it very quiet and everything appeared normal. Even Danilo seemed asleep and unaware of anything happening in the house. Approaching Danilo on the bed, Mark suspected that he wasn't breathing. He moved closer and gently turned Danilo's face towards him, but the sight that met him made him fall to the floor from shock and fear. Danilo's appearance was terrifying. His eyes were fully open, completely white without any black color. His teeth were highly pronounced, and his mouth was wide open with teeth sticking out. His neck bore a deep wound, so meticulously inflicted that it seemed only a skilled surgeon could have made it. Mark began to crawl on the floor, terrified and fearing that whoever killed Danilo was still around. After leaving the room, he ran quickly to his room, locked himself in, trying to calm himself down, and decided he had to leave. Then, he heard a noise from behind the door. Opening the door cautiously, he was shocked to see Danilo standing in front of him, asking him to come to the room because he needed his medicine. Mark was stunned by what was happening and froze, unable to speak. Danilo repeated his request, causing Mark to nod his head without being able to utter a word. Danilo walked away, and Mark returned to his room, suddenly hearing knocks on the wardrobe as if someone was knocking on a door. Approaching the wardrobe, the noise stopped. When he opened the wardrobe door, he found nothing. All his clothes had disappeared, replaced by a letter. Opening it, Mark found words written in faint red ink, clearly written with great difficulty. He began to read. "Now you are undoubtedly a prisoner like me. I don't know if you can escape or if your end will be like mine. What you must realize is that you will be the next sacrifice, you and anyone related to this house. It's certain that you are part of the nursing staff and came to take care of that elderly patient, but the horrifying truth is that he is dead. He and those guards, that tall, dark-skinned man who was killed by Danilo and seems to have returned for revenge." The letter ends. At that moment, Mark began to feel that the house had become quieter. At that moment, he decided to escape. He opened the bedroom door and walked past Danilo's room. The door was closed. As Mark approached Danilo's bedroom door, it suddenly swung open, and Danilo was inside, hanging from the ceiling. As soon as Mark saw him, he ran in fear. He opened the house door and quickly left while calling for help. He informed them of the location. Within minutes, the rescue vehicle arrived, and Mark got in with them. But suddenly, the officer asked him why he was there. Mark told him that he worked as a nurse and received a call that someone in the house needed medical care. The officer spoke with Mark and told him that the house was haunted, and whoever called him was probably joking with him. Mark arrived at the house. As soon as he entered, he heard his phone ring. It was Michael's number. Mark answered, and before he could speak, Michael congratulated him for being able to live, and the line got cut off. Mark tried to call Michael again, but he was always out of service range. Mark began searching for Danilo's house. He found out that indeed Danilo and Stefan had been living in the house, and there was a dispute between them that ended with Danilo stabbing Stefan with a knife and then committing suicide. Since then, the house had been off limits.